Before we begin the horror show, tell me where you're from. Drop your city name in the comments, and if there's a creepy story tied to it, I'll make sure to feature it in a future video. Your city's frightful past could be the next to terrorize us all. Story number 1. For over a century, the Lorne Mansion had loomed on the outskirts of town like a silent specter. Its ornate gates, twisted with rust and overgrowth, seemed to beckon and warn in equal measure. Locals refused to venture near it, recounting tales of Silas Lorne, a man who had amassed incredible wealth but left behind a legacy steeped in whispers of cruelty and darkness. The mansion's reputation grew even darker after Silas's mysterious disappearance. Stories circulated of strange lights flickering in the windows, muffled cries in the dead of night, and visitors who never returned. Over time, the estate fell into disrepair, becoming a labyrinth of decayed grandeur and unsettling silence. But there was one tale that terrified even the most hardened skeptic: the legend of the flesh room. It was said to be Silas's final, most horrific creation, a room that defied understanding, forged from human skin, and imbued with a sinister life of its own. Those who dared speak of it claimed it was the key to his obsession with immortality, a chamber that fed on the living to keep itself and Silas alive. The legend was enough to keep most people far away. But for Danny, Jenna, Mark, and Lydia, it was irresistible. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth as the group stood before the mansion's gates. Each held a flashlight, though their beams barely pierced the oppressive gloom. "This place is a dump," Danny muttered, kicking at a broken stone near the gate. His skepticism was evident in every step, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Mark adjusted the straps of his backpack, his voice tinged with excitement. "Come on, Danny, this is the ultimate urban legend. Think of the headlines: Journalist uncovers truth about Lorne Mansion." "Yeah," Jenna added, her camera already rolling. "And imagine the views on my channel. Creepy old house, dark legends, maybe a ghost or two. This could go viral." Lydia remained silent, her gaze fixed on the mansion. She had always been the quiet one, the one who believed in things the others dismissed as superstition. But tonight, her silence felt different. "Lydia?" Jenna prompted. "You okay?" Lydia blinked, as if pulled from a trance. "I'm fine. Just stay close, okay?" The group pushed open the gates, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Beyond lay a garden overrun with weeds, their tendrils clawing at the cracked stone paths. The mansion loomed ahead, its facade a mix of faded elegance and creeping decay. "I can't believe we're doing this," Danny grumbled as they approached the front door. "Come on, it's just an old house," Mark said, pulling out a crowbar to pry open the door. "What's the worst that could happen?" The lock gave way with a sharp crack, and the door swung open to reveal the foyer. Dust swirled in the flashlight beams, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. Inside, the mansion was a strange juxtaposition of opulence and ruin. A grand staircase dominated the foyer, its banister warped with age. Portraits of long-dead Lorne family members lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders. "This is perfect," Jenna whispered, her camera capturing every detail. "It's like stepping into a horror movie." Mark chuckled. "Let's hope we don't become the main characters." They began to explore, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty halls. Each room told a story of decay. A dining room with a table still set for a long-forgotten feast, a parlor where furniture crumbled under the weight of years, a library where books dissolved into moldy piles. But as they moved deeper into the mansion, an unsettling pattern emerged. The walls in certain rooms were different. The wallpaper, once vibrant, seemed to blister and peel, revealing a texture underneath that was disturbingly organic. "Do you see this?" Lydia asked, running her hand over the surface. The wallpaper felt warm, almost alive. Jenna zoomed in with her camera. "That's disgusting. What is it?" Mark frowned. "It's probably just water damage. Old houses like this are full of weird stuff." Lydia shook her head. "This isn't water damage. It feels like skin." Danny laughed nervously. "Come on, Lydia. Skin walls? Really?" But no one else was laughing. The sound of a bell rang suddenly, faint but distinct. It echoed through the halls, sending a chill down their spines. Did you hear that? Jenna whispered. It's probably the wind, Danny said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Lydia's face was pale. Number, that's the bell Silas Lorne used to summon his servants. It's in the legends. Great, Danny muttered. Haunted house cliches. What's next? Ghostly whispers? As if on cue, a faint wet sound reached their ears. It was like flesh being dragged across stone, coming from somewhere deep within the house. We should leave, Lydia said, her voice trembling. Not yet, Mark insisted. We haven't even found the basement. That's where the flesh room is supposed to be. Jenna nodded, her excitement outweighing her fear. We've come this far. We can't back out now. Reluctantly, Lydia followed as they pressed on, the sound growing louder with each step. The deeper they ventured into the mansion, the stranger the house became. The hallways seemed to twist and stretch, their dimensions subtly shifting, as if the mansion itself were alive. Danny's skepticism was beginning to crack under the oppressive atmosphere, while Lydia grew increasingly agitated. Are you sure we're going the right way? Jenna asked, her voice low. Mark held up his phone, its flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The map says the basement door should be ahead. The map is over 100 years old, Danny muttered, his frustration mounting. For all we know, the basement could have been bricked up or collapsed. Quiet, Lydia hissed, stopping abruptly. She turned her flashlight toward a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and from the crack came the faint, wet sound they had heard earlier. That's it, she whispered, her face pale. Mark grinned, his bravado masking the unease that gnawed at him. Let's find out what's behind door number 1. He pushed the door open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The air was colder here, carrying a faint, sickly sweet odor that turned their stomachs. Great, Danny said, his sarcasm failing to mask his nervousness. The creepy basement. Classic Jenna filmed their descent, her camera capturing the damp, crumbling walls and the occasional flicker of something moving just out of sight. The deeper they went, the stronger the smell became, and the sound of dripping water mingled with the faint groans that seemed to come from the very walls. The staircase ended in a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred with deep, jagged marks. Looks like someone tried to claw their way out, Jenna murmured, her fingers brushing over the grooves. Or something tried to claw its way in, Danny added grimly. Mark shoved the door open, revealing a cavernous room that seemed to defy logic. The walls were covered in what looked like flesh, pulsating gently as if alive. The floor was sticky, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. In the center of the room stood a grotesque altar, made of bone and sinew, its surface slick with some unidentifiable fluid. Around it, scattered in a haphazard circle, were objects that seemed to belong to the mansion's victims. A tattered scarf, a blood-stained shoe, a rusted locket. Oh my God, Lydia whispered, her hand covering her mouth. What the hell is this? Danny demanded, his voice shaking. Mark approached the altar, his flashlight illuminating the grotesque carvings that adorned its surface. This must be where Silas performed his rituals. Look at these symbols. They're ancient, maybe even pre-Christian. As he spoke, the walls seemed to shudder, and the groans grew louder. A low, guttural voice echoed through the room, speaking in a language none of them recognized. Did you hear that? Jenna asked, her camera trembling in her hands. It's the house, Lydia said, backing away from the altar. It's alive, and it's hungry. The voice grew louder, the words guttural and filled with malice. Suddenly, one of the walls split open, revealing what looked like a gaping maw lined with teeth made of jagged bone. Run! Lydia screamed, but it was too late. The room erupted into chaos. The walls pulsated violently, and the floor seemed to ripple like a living organism. Jenna screamed as something cold and wet wrapped around her ankle, dragging her toward the fleshy maw. Help me, she cried, clawing at the ground. Mark and Danny grabbed her arms, pulling with all their strength. The tendril tightened its grip, and a sickening crunch echoed through the room as Jenna's leg twisted unnaturally. Let her go, you bastard, Danny shouted, slamming a broken piece of wood against the tendril. It writhed in pain, releasing Jenna, who scrambled to her feet. We have to get out of here, Lydia yelled, pointing toward the door. But the door was gone, replaced by a wall of pulsating flesh. The room was closing in on them, its grotesque walls pressing closer with every second. Mark's flashlight flickered, casting brief glimpses of horrifying shapes writhing within the walls. Faces, hands, and limbs, all struggling to break free. "What is this place?" Jenna sobbed, clutching her injured leg. "It's the flesh room," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "It's alive. It's been feeding on people for centuries." The altar began to glow with an eerie red light, and the voice grew louder, its words now recognizable. "Join us. Become one. Feed the house." Mark's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "It's trying to absorb us. We're the next victims." The group huddled together, their backs to the altar. The walls continued to close in, and the room's grotesque features grew more pronounced. The faces within the walls began to scream, their cries merging with the guttural voice to create a deafening cacophony. "We have to destroy the altar," Lydia said suddenly. "It's the source of the house's power." "You're insane," Danny replied. "How do you know that?" "I just do," Lydia shouted. "Do you have a better idea?" Mark grabbed a piece of broken wood and approached the altar. As he raised it above his head, the room seemed to react, the walls convulsing violently. A tendril shot out, wrapping around his wrist and yanking him toward the altar. "Mark!" Jenna screamed. Lydia and Danny lunged forward, grabbing Mark and pulling him back. The tendril released him, and he slammed the piece of wood into the altar with all his strength. The room let out an ear-piercing shriek, and the glow from the altar intensified. The walls began to collapse inward, and the floor cracked open, revealing a dark, churning void beneath them. "We have to go," Lydia shouted, pulling Jenna to her feet. "But there's no way out," Danny yelled. As if in response, a section of the wall crumbled, revealing a narrow tunnel. Without hesitation, the group sprinted toward it, the floor crumbling beneath their feet. The group barely made it through the crumbling opening in the wall. The tunnel stretched before them, its jagged walls slick with a viscous, fleshy substance that seemed to pulse faintly under their flashlights. The nauseating smell of rot and iron filled their lungs, making each breath a struggle. "Where does this lead?" Danny asked, his voice trembling as he glanced back toward the collapsing room behind them. The distant roar of the flesh room still echoed, like a predator watching its prey flee. "I don't know," Lydia admitted, her voice tight with fear, "but it's the only way out." Mark limped ahead, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his shirt from a deep gash inflicted by the tendril. Jenna, though pale and shaking, tried to keep pace despite her injured leg. Danny supported her, though his own hands were trembling. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, they began to hear faint whispers echoing around them. The voices overlapped, their tones ranging from pleading to accusatory. "You shouldn't have come. It's too late. You'll never leave." "What is that?" Jenna whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "They're the voices of its victims," Lydia said, barely above a whisper. "They're trapped here, in the house." Danny scoffed, though his voice betrayed his growing panic. "Great. Ghosts now. What's next? Demons?" The tunnel abruptly widened into a large chamber. The floor was uneven, made of a mix of stone and the same fleshy material that seemed to be growing like mold. In the center of the chamber stood a massive structure, a grotesque throne made entirely of bone and sinew. Sitting on the throne was a figure that froze them in their tracks. It was humanoid in shape but horrifyingly distorted. Its skin appeared stretched and translucent, revealing pulsating veins and sinewy muscles underneath. Its face was an amalgamation of features, dozens of eyes, mouths, and ears arranged haphazardly, as though it had absorbed countless victims into itself. "Oh my God," Jenna breathed, tears streaming down her face. The creature tilted its head, regarding them with an unnatural curiosity. When it spoke, its voice was a cacophony of whispers, screams, and groans. "Why do you run?" Danny stepped forward, clutching a broken piece of wood like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The creature didn't move. Instead, it extended an elongated hand, its fingers grotesquely long and tipped with sharp claws. The whispers grew louder, and the air around them seemed to thicken. "Don't listen to it," Lydia warned, gripping Mark's arm. "It's trying to get into your head." But it was too late. Danny froze, his eyes glazing over as he dropped his makeshift weapon. His lips moved silently, as though answering a question only he could hear. "Danny!" Jenna screamed, but he didn't respond. The creature rose from its throne, its movements unnaturally fluid. It loomed over Danny, its many mouths curving into a grotesque approximation of a smile. Before anyone could react, it plunged its claws into his chest. Danny let out a gurgled scream as the creature lifted him off the ground. His body convulsed, and his flesh seemed to dissolve, merging with the creature's own. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving only his bloodied shoes behind. Jenna collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Mark pulled her to her feet, his own face pale with terror. "We have to keep moving," Lydia urged, her voice sharp. "Now!" The creature turned its many eyes toward them, its mouths opening in a deafening roar. The chamber began to shake, the walls pulsating violently. The group sprinted through another tunnel, the creature's roars echoing behind them. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor grew slick with blood and other unidentifiable fluids. "We're not going to make it," Jenna sobbed, stumbling over a jagged rock. "Yes, we will," Mark shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. They emerged into another chamber, smaller but no less horrifying. The walls were lined with what looked like cocoons, each one pulsating faintly. Inside, they could see shapes, humanoid figures trapped in varying states of decay. "They're alive," Lydia whispered, her face pale. One of the cocoons twitched, and a muffled scream echoed through the chamber. Mark shone his flashlight on it, revealing a face pressed against the translucent surface. The person's eyes were wide with terror, their mouth open in a silent plea for help. "We can't stay here," Mark said, his voice trembling. As they turned to leave, the cocoons began to burst open. Slimy, half-decayed figures stumbled out, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. "Run!" Lydia screamed, shoving Mark and Jenna toward another tunnel. The creatures lunged at them, their movements jerky but relentless. Mark swung his flashlight like a weapon, smashing it into one of the creature's heads. It crumpled to the ground, but more took its place. They sprinted down the tunnel, the sounds of their pursuers growing louder. Just when it seemed they were cornered, the tunnel opened into yet another chamber. This one was dominated by a massive, swirling vortex in the center of the room. "What the hell is that?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the vortex. "It's the heart of the house," Lydia said, her eyes wide. "The source of its power." The vortex seemed to pull at them, its force growing stronger with every second. The creatures hesitated at the edge of the chamber, as though afraid to approach. "We can destroy it," Lydia said, stepping toward the vortex. "How?" Mark demanded. Lydia held up the bone dagger she had found earlier. It's connected to the house. If we destroy it, we destroy everything." Sam, Clara, and Victor found themselves standing at the lip of the vortex, a swirling abyss of human flesh and anguished faces. The walls around them pulsated, veins threading through the decrepit mansion as if it were alive. The house groaned, its rage palpable, and a voice thundered in their minds. "No one escapes! Feed me, or be consumed!" Clutching the bone dagger, Sam steeled himself, his knuckles white. Clara's flashlight flickered as she caught a glimpse of a face she recognized in the vortex. It was Alex, their missing friend, his mouth stretched in a silent scream. The house wasn't just killing people, it was trapping their souls. Victor, trembling, suddenly lost his composure. "We can't fight this. We're dead. This place is hell." He turned to run but froze mid-step. From the darkness, sinewy tendrils burst forth, wrapping around his legs and dragging him toward the vortex. His screams echoed as the flesh consumed him, his body disappearing into the writhing pit. Clara and Sam backed away, their breaths ragged. Sam raised the bone dagger. "We have to destroy the core. It's the only way." The house spoke again, its voice now more insidious and seductive. "Spare me, and I will grant you power, eternal life. You will never feel pain, never grow old." Clara hesitated, her eyes wide as visions of her dead sister flashed before her. The house was reading her mind, offering her the one thing she wanted most, her sister's return. "Don't listen to it," Sam shouted. "It's lying." But Clara stepped closer to the vortex, her voice trembling. "If there's even a chance—" Before she could finish, The tendrils lashed out again, wrapping around her wrist. Sam lunged forward, slicing at them with the dagger. The tendrils recoiled, screeching like wounded animals, and Clara fell to the ground, sobbing. The house roared, the vortex expanding. Faces began emerging from the walls, their eyes hollow and mouths wide, chanting in unison. "Join us! Feed us! Join us!" Sam realized what had to be done. The dagger wasn't just a weapon, it was a key. The handle bore strange carvings. Runes he now understood were meant to be plunged into the heart of the vortex. But it required a sacrifice. Someone had to go in with it. "I'm going to end this," Sam said, his voice steady. Clara grabbed his arm. "You'll die. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Sam replied, a sad smile on his face. "Get out of here. Tell people what happened." Before Clara could protest, Sam sprinted toward the vortex. The tendrils lashed out, but he dodged them, leaping into the swirling pit. He drove the dagger deep into the core, and the house let out an unearthly scream. The faces in the walls contorted, their chants turning into wails of agony. The vortex began to collapse, sucking everything into itself. Clara ran, dodging falling debris as the mansion crumbled around her. She barely made it out before the entire structure imploded, leaving nothing but a smoking crater. Clara sat in the grass, staring at the void where the mansion once stood. She was alive, but her relief was short-lived. From the distance, she heard faint whispers, Sam's voice calling her name. The crater began to pulse, veins forming around its edges. The house was gone, but its curse remained. Clara realized with chilling clarity the flesh room would rebuild itself, and it was only a matter of time before it lured in its next victims. The camera pans out as Clara walks away, her shadow stretching unnaturally long. In the distance, the faint outline of the mansion begins to reappear, as if being stitched back together by unseen hands. The whispers grow louder, promising that the house's hunger will never end. Story 2. The storm had rolled in without warning, as it often did in the lonely countryside, a harbinger of the horrors that would unfold. It started with a gentle whisper in the wind, then grew louder, a howling crescendo that swallowed the sounds of nature. The heavy rain pummeled the land, turning the narrow road into a slick, muddy mess. It was the kind of storm that seemed to possess a mind of its own, creeping through the trees and suffocating the night. But for 3 weary travelers, the storm had become nothing more than an inconvenience. They were all too familiar with the dangers of the open road. None of them had an easy life. None of them had an easy escape. They moved quickly through the downpour, their footsteps sluggish against the wet ground, each driven by the same need: shelter. Elijah, a young man in his mid-20s, had been traveling for months, lost and adrift after a falling out with his family. He had the look of someone who'd seen too much but still sought redemption, hoping that the next village, the next street corner, might be the place where he could bury his past. Rebecca, a woman in her early 30s, had lost much in her life: her home, her friends, her entire sense of self. The weight of grief had driven her to wander aimlessly, as if hoping the road would sweep her away from her memories. She carried her pain in silence, always careful not to let anyone get too close. Jacob, the oldest of the 3, was a man whose eyes had long since stopped seeing the world around him. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was always holding back some dark secret, something that had drained the life from him. The storm had not fazed him. He had seen many storms in his time, both literal and metaphorical. None of them had spoken much to one another, but the storm had driven them together. They were strangers bound by necessity, and they had little choice but to walk the same path. A path that seemed to twist and wind deeper into the unknown with each step. The rain had soaked them through to their bones, but when they saw the faint glow ahead, just beyond the thick tree line, hope flickered in their hearts. A house, a mansion, to be precise. It rose from the darkness like a forgotten relic, the flickering light casting long shadows that danced across the crumbling walls. The estate appeared to be ancient, though it still held a strange grandeur despite its decay. It was as if time had forgotten this place, leaving it to rot in peace, unnoticed. "Do you see that?" Elijah asked, his voice a faint rasp as he squinted against the rain. There's a light inside. Rebecca hesitated, her fingers wrapped tightly around the strap of her satchel. It's an old house, probably abandoned. Jacob, whose voice had remained low and unbothered, spoke. An old house is still better than being out here in the storm. With no other options, they made their way toward the house, the mud clinging to their boots and the rain turning the air cold. As they drew closer, the mansion grew more imposing, its towering silhouette blending with the darkening sky. The windows, once bright and inviting, now looked like hollow eyes staring down at them with an eerie vacancy. The wooden door, half rotted and cracked, creaked as it swayed in the wind, though no one seemed to be on the other side. Elijah reached out tentatively, pushing the door open with a low groan that echoed through the hallway beyond. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. Despite the musty smell, there was a faint scent of something else. Something almost sweet, yet sharp, like rot mixed with spice. It made the back of Elijah's throat tighten, but he ignored the sensation, pressing forward. The hallway stretched out before them, dimly lit by a flickering candle mounted on a table. The grand staircase rose ahead, its steps darkened with age, each one covered in dust. There was no sign of life, but that strange metallic scent persisted in the air, hanging like a cloud. The door closed behind them, though no one had touched it. It was as if the house had swallowed them whole. They stood frozen for a moment, each of them caught between fear and the nagging desire to seek warmth and safety. Rebecca took a step forward, and Elijah followed. Jacob, ever the silent observer, took a long breath, as if weighing the decision to enter. He glanced at the shadows, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right, but there was nowhere else to go. Then from the depths of the house, a voice rang out. "Welcome. I've been expecting guests." The voice was low, smooth, and oddly comforting, like someone who had been alone for far too long. It carried with it an unsettling familiarity, like an invitation to a long-forgotten feast. The words seemed to echo through the house, growing louder as they reached the travelers. And then the figure appeared. At the end of the hallway, standing at the entrance of a large dining room, was a man. He was tall and thin, with an air of faded elegance despite the tattered state of his clothes. His face was pale, almost sickly, with sharp features that gave him the appearance of someone who had once been well regarded, someone who had belonged to another time. His eyes were dark, gleaming with an unnatural gleam. "I apologize for the state of the house," the man said with a thin smile, though there was no real warmth behind it. "It's been some time since I've had guests, but I am delighted to offer you dinner. I trust you've traveled far and would appreciate a meal." Rebecca, despite the foreboding atmosphere, felt her stomach lurch with hunger. Elijah, too, could feel the pangs of his empty stomach. The storm making food seemed like the only thing that mattered. Jacob remained silent, his gaze shifting between the man and the darkened corners of the house. "Who are you?" Elijah asked, though his voice cracked. "What is this place?" The man chuckled softly, a sound that felt both empty and knowing. "I am simply your host for the evening. My name is Victor. This house, it has always had a certain way of drawing people in. You must be hungry after such a long journey." The flickering light from the candles cast long shadows on the walls as Victor motioned for them to follow him. His every movement was measured, almost deliberate, as if he were performing a ritual he'd done countless times before. Elijah looked at Rebecca, but she was already moving forward, drawn by the warmth of the room and the promise of a meal. Jacob followed silently, his eyes narrowing as he took one last look around the hallway. The house seemed to swallow them whole as they stepped into the dining room, a large, ornate space filled with antique furniture and rich tapestries. The table before them was set with fine china and silverware, the kind of opulence that spoke of wealth and power. And at the center of it all, there was the unmistakable scent of roasted meats. Victor pulled out a chair for each of them, his gaze never leaving their faces. The room was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. The candles burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls as the guests took their seats. "I've prepared something special for you," Victor said, his voice smooth and calculated. "Please, enjoy." The food was laid before them, an array of roasted meats, vegetables, and bread that looked fresh and perfectly cooked. Elijah's mouth watered at the sight, and Rebecca's eyes widened in relief. It was just food, just a simple meal. Nothing more. But as they dug into the meal, a sense of unease settled in the pit of their stomachs. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was something in the air, something about the food that felt off, though he couldn't place it. And as he took another bite, he noticed, from the corner of his eye, the shadows at the edge of the table, moving. Elijah's mouth went dry as he continued to chew the tender meat on his plate. The taste was rich, almost too rich, and there was something about the texture that didn't quite sit right. It was as if the meat was too smooth, too soft, too perfect. The savory flavor seemed to cling to his tongue, and he swallowed hard, trying to ignore the growing unease gnawing at him. His stomach growled in protest as his appetite wrestled with his instincts. Beside him, Rebecca seemed to be in a trance-like state, her eyes glued to the food, her fork moving mechanically from the plate to her mouth. She was eating without question, without hesitation, her cheeks flushed, and for a brief moment, the tension that had gripped her since their arrival seemed to dissipate. But Elijah wasn't fooled. He saw it, the flicker in her eyes, the slight twitch of her fingers as she reached for another bite. She too was struggling with the sense that something was wrong. "Isn't it wonderful?" Victor's voice broke through the silence, his tone calm and satisfied. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting with an almost predatory gleam. "I pride myself on preparing the finest meals. You see, the ingredients are quite unique." Elijah froze mid-bite. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud. He glanced at Victor, but the man's face was an unreadable mask of polite curiosity. A chill spread through Elijah's spine. The way Victor said ingredients made his stomach churn. Rebecca, her face flushed from the warmth of the fire, smiled wanly. "It's delicious," she said, but her voice was strained. "What is it?" Victor's smile remained fixed, though his eyes narrowed slightly as if considering the question carefully. "Oh, nothing special. A blend of herbs and spices with a touch of the local flavor." He chuckled, the sound hollow in the vast room. The hair on the back of Elijah's neck stood up. The words, innocent as they might have seemed, had a sinister undertone. Local flavor, he thought. What the hell did that mean? He tried to shake the thought from his head. It was ridiculous. He was hungry, and after days of travel in the storm, the warm meal was a welcome relief. But then his mind flashed back to his mother's warning, the tales of strange disappearances in far-off places. And there was something about this house, about Victor, that felt wrong. "I must apologize for the state of the house," Victor continued, sipping from his glass of red wine. "It's been a long time since I've had the pleasure of hosting, but there's nothing like a good meal to bring back memories of happier times." He set down the glass, his gaze lingering on each of the travelers in turn, the smile never leaving his lips. Nothing like a good meal to heal wounds and satiate appetites. Elijah could feel the weight of those words sinking into him, deeper and deeper. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, creeping toward them, casting strange shapes on the walls. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the edges of the room. It was as if the darkness was alive, pulsing with the beating of something far more ancient, far more malevolent than he could comprehend. He put down his fork and stood abruptly, the sound of the chair scraping against the wooden floor filling the room. Rebecca glanced up in surprise, but her face seemed to blur, as though she were staring through him, not at him. "I need to step outside," Elijah muttered, his voice low, almost strangled. Victor's eyes locked onto him, a cold amusement flickering behind his dark irises. "Of course," he said, his voice smooth like velvet. "Please take your time, but I do recommend that you not stray too far. The weather can be unpredictable at night." Without waiting for a response, Elijah turned and made his way toward the door. He needed air, needed to clear his head. His heart pounded in his chest, the unease from earlier twisting into a full-blown panic. The candlelight flickered behind him, casting long shadows across the floor as he exited the dining room. The corridor outside was just as dim as the dining hall, the walls draped in faded tapestries, the air heavy with the smell of age and dust. But there was something else now. Something more sinister that clung to the atmosphere, like an oppressive weight. Elijah's breath quickened, and he hurried toward the nearest window. He reached the thick wooden frame and peered outside. The storm had stopped, but the moon was hidden behind a blanket of clouds. The world beyond the window was swallowed in darkness, with nothing but trees in the shape of distant hills to mark the horizon. The silence was deafening. No birds, no wind, nothing. But then he heard it, a soft scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest. From the shadows at the far end of the hallway, he saw something move, a figure hunched and crawling, its limbs twitching unnaturally as it scuttled toward him. The grotesque thing was covered in tattered clothes, but the face was featureless, smooth and pale, as if someone had peeled away the skin, leaving only a gaping void. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. His body froze as the creature's eyeless gaze locked onto him, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. Before he could react, it vanished into the darkness. Elijah staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. The scream he had expected never came. The creature simply disappeared into the shadows as though it had never existed. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but every inch of his body screamed that he needed to leave, that the very air in this place was toxic. He turned back toward the dining room, but before he could reach the door, a low laugh echoed through the hallway. It was Victor, but the sound, though unmistakable, had an edge to it, something primal, something darker than he'd ever heard before. "Are you not hungry anymore?" Victor's voice floated toward him, distorted by a mocking edge. "There's still plenty more to eat." Elijah hesitated, his fingers trembling against the doorframe. Something was terribly wrong, and he knew it now, deep in his gut. This was no ordinary man. This was no ordinary place. His mind raced, memories of strange rumors he had heard about this place beginning to surface. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, and yet here it was, filled with life. He had heard whispers in the tavern, hushed voices speaking of a cannibal's feast, of drifters disappearing without a trace, and now he was part of it. The door to the dining room opened, and there stood Victor, his smile wide and knowing. Behind him, the room was no longer filled with just food. It was filled with shadows, grotesque figures moving in the corners of the room, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies rotting and half-eaten. "This is where they all end up," Victor said softly, his voice now full of dark satisfaction. "This is where they all come to feast." Elijah's eyes widened as he saw, for the first time, the full extent of what Victor had prepared. The once perfect meal had transformed into a banquet of horrors. The meat was no longer recognizable as anything human. The smell had grown overpowering, sickeningly sweet, like decay mixed with rot. Victor stepped forward, his arms outstretched as if to embrace Elijah. "You're just another course, my friend," and he whispered, "and there's no way out." The door slammed shut behind Elijah, and the last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him whole was the sound of gnawing teeth. Elijah's heart was pounding in his chest as he stumbled backward, his hands pressing against the cold stone walls for support. The grotesque figures in the dining hall moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their mouths twisted into grotesque grins, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. He could hear the scraping of nails against the floor as they crawled closer, dragging their bloated bodies toward him. The air in the room was thick with the stench of rot, the sharp tang of decay that made his stomach twist. He fought the urge to gag as he looked back at Victor, whose smile had only grown wider, more satisfied. It was the smile of a man who had already won, who had already planned every move. "Welcome to my table, Elijah," Victor said, his voice calm and chilling. "We've been waiting for you." The words hung in the air, a sickening invitation, and the walls seemed to close in around Elijah. His mind raced, trying to find an escape, but there was no way out. The room was no longer just a dining hall. It was a trap, an endless abyss of hunger and death. He could feel the walls pressing in on him, suffocating him, as if the house itself was alive, feeding off his terror. "Victor, what is this? What have you done?" Elijah gasped, his voice shaking. Victor's eyes flickered with amusement, and he slowly stood up from his chair, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. I've done what I must to survive, Elijah, and now you're part of the family. Don't worry, you'll fit right in. The figures around the room began to shuffle closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they hadn't seen the light of day in years. One of them, a bloated man with pale, waxy skin, reached out with a twisted, clawed hand, grabbing the edge of the table. His fingers flexed, snapping and bending as if they were broken, but the creature paid no mind. Elijah took another step back, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He was trapped. The dining room door was behind him, but the figures were closing in too quickly. And then he realized something far worse. The figures weren't just crawling closer to him, they were waiting for Victor's signal. Victor stepped forward, holding a gleaming knife in his hand. You see, Elijah, I've been feeding these hungry souls for years. They were my guests once, just like you. But now they are my family, and you will join us. The feast has only just begun. Elijah's eyes darted frantically across the room. He needed to escape. There had to be something, some way out. His gaze landed on the window, the only way out. But the glass was too high up, too far to reach, and the door behind him was blocked by the creatures. There was no escape. Then a chilling realization washed over him. These people, they weren't just guests. They were the ones who had disappeared. They had been here before, just like him. They had once sat at this table, eaten this food, and now they were part of it. Victor raised the knife high, and the grotesque figures behind him echoed the movement, their claws scraping the table, their mouths open in anticipation. Elijah felt the last of his strength fade. His breath quickened, and his pulse thundered in his ears. There was no way out, no escape. His mind screamed, but his body refused to move. He was frozen, helpless. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, a sound that reverberated through the room. The dining hall trembled, and for a moment, everything stopped. The figures paused, their eyes fixed on the broken door at the far end of the room. Victor's gaze flickered toward the door, his expression momentarily faltering. That brief moment was all Elijah needed. He lunged toward the table, his hands grabbing anything they could, his heart pounding with raw, desperate energy. He grabbed a broken wine bottle from the table, the sharp edge of the glass glinting in the dim light. In one swift motion, he swung the bottle at Victor's face, the glass shattering with a sickening crack. The shards embedded themselves in Victor's cheek, and he screamed in pain, staggering back. The grotesque figures around him recoiled as if they were afraid. Elijah didn't wait for a second chance. He darted past Victor, shoving aside one of the crawling figures that reached out for him. His legs were weak, but adrenaline coursed through his veins as he sprinted toward the door. The creatures screeched behind him, their voices rising in a chorus of hunger and rage. But he didn't stop. He didn't look back. His only thought was to get out of this nightmare, to escape the hellish dining hall that had become a prison. He reached the door. It was ajar, barely open, but there was light on the other side. He could see the moonlight filtering through the crack, a lifeline to the outside world. He shoved the door open with all his strength, and for a brief moment, the cool night air hit his face. But just as he stepped outside, a hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing his ankle with an iron grip. He fell forward, his hands scraping against the ground as he fought to free himself. His breath caught in his throat as the creature's claws dug into his flesh. Before he could react, the figure pulled him back into the shadows. His scream was cut short as something heavy pressed down on his chest. He looked up, his eyes wide in terror, and saw the figure of Victor looming above him, blood dripping from his face where the glass had pierced his skin. "You thought you could escape?" Victor sneered, his face twisted in fury. "You're already part of the feast, Elijah. You can't run from what you've become." Elijah's vision blurred as the world around him spun. He could hear the creatures, the hollow whispers of those who had become part of Victor's twisted family, their voices all around him. But in his final moments, the screams of the dead seemed distant, like an echo in a dark, empty void. As the last shred of his strength left him, Elijah realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't just a guest at the table, he was the last course. Victor's twisted grin widened, and with one final, chilling motion, he drove the knife deep into Elijah's chest, silencing his scream forever. The last thing Elijah saw was the grotesque faces of the cannibals closing in, their hungry eyes gleaming in the moonlight, eager for their share of the feast. Story number 3. The invitation arrived late in the evening, tucked neatly under the door of Marlowe's investigative paranormal agency. It was a simple, old-fashioned envelope, stained with ink and bearing no return address. Inside, there was a single sheet of yellowed paper with jagged, handwritten letters that sent a chill down Marlowe's spine as he read, "We are reaching out to you for help. The house calls for you. The walls breathe, and we fear it will consume us. Please investigate. We are the last ones left." The letter was unsigned, but it was clear who it was meant for. Marlowe had built a reputation for tackling the most disturbing paranormal phenomena, and this case was unlike anything he had seen before. The mansion in question, located on the outskirts of a long-forgotten village, had been abandoned for decades. Yet recently, strange occurrences had been reported. People who ventured too close at night claimed to hear eerie breathing sounds, a low rumbling that seemed to come from within the walls. The most troubling part of the invitation, however, was the mention of the wallpaper. The walls breathe as if alive. The wallpaper moves as though veins pulse beneath it. Marlowe had heard of haunted houses, possessed objects, and cursed spirits, but never had he encountered something so physical. It seemed like a challenge, and Marlowe couldn't resist. He packed his bags, gathered his team: Sarah, a sensitive with a sharp intuition; Thomas, a tech expert who could get any equipment to work in the most hostile environments; and Emma, the newest recruit, a skeptic with a keen eye for details. Together they set off for the mansion, unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. The mansion loomed before them as they arrived in the dead of night. Its silhouette was jagged, like the bones of some long-dead creature. The windows were dark and vacant, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The ground was choked with weeds, and the surrounding trees seemed twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. Marlowe's breath caught in his throat as he gazed at the building. There was something wrong about it, something that stirred a primal fear deep within him. "This is it," Marlowe said, breaking the silence. "Let's get to work." The team entered the mansion cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of rot clung to everything. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern that once might have been vibrant, was peeling in large, irregular patches, as though something was trying to break through from beneath. As Sarah walked further into the room, she stopped and placed her hand on the wall. Her brow furrowed and a shiver ran down her spine. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. The others stopped in their tracks. Marlowe turned to look at her, his expression tense. It's like the wall is breathing," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "Like it's alive." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You're imagining things, Sarah." But Marlowe wasn't so sure. He could feel it too, that faint, almost imperceptible pulse in the air. It was as though the house itself was alive, its very bones stirring. "Let's get to work," Marlowe said, trying to shake the unease that settled over him. "Emma, set up the cameras. Thomas, start mapping the place out. Sarah, stay close to me." They spread out through the mansion, their movements deliberate. As Marlowe passed through the hallway, he couldn't help but glance at the wallpaper. It was shifting, subtly but unmistakably, as if the veins of the house were pulsing beneath it. He reached out and touched it. It was warm to the touch, uncomfortably so, like the surface of something that was alive. A sudden, low rumble reverberated through the floor, followed by a strange, guttural sound. Marlowe's heart skipped a beat, and he turned towards Sarah, who looked as though she had seen a ghost. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It came from below," Marlowe replied, his hand still pressed against the wall. "The foundation." But when they looked down, there was nothing but darkness. The mansion's silence settled back in, oppressive and suffocating. The mansion's suffocating silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the soft scrape of Sarah's fingertips against the wall. The wallpaper seemed to undulate beneath her touch, as if some unseen force was pressing against it, fighting to break free. The room was cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from their flickering flashlights, which cast erratic shadows on the peeling walls. "Did you feel that?" Sarah asked again, her voice barely a whisper, her hand still pressed against the wallpaper. Marlowe turned his attention to her, his brow furrowed in concern. He had been watching the strange patterns on the wall shift too, but he wasn't sure whether it was a trick of the light or something far more sinister. "Let's stay focused," Marlowe said, trying to hide the unease creeping into his voice. "We need to gather evidence, and that means we need to start documenting everything. Let's check the rest of the house." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her fingers trembled as she pressed harder against the wall, trying to make sense of the strange sensation building beneath the surface. It felt like a heartbeat, slow but deliberate. She could feel it now, thumping, pulsing, as though the wall was breathing. She jerked her hand back, a sharp breath escaping her lips. "Marlowe, I think this house is alive." Marlowe looked at her, unsure of how to respond. The air in the room had grown heavier, almost suffocating. He turned to his team. "Keep moving in," he said more forcefully now. "We're not here to get distracted. Let's finish the sweep." But as he spoke, a low rumble reverberated from the floor beneath him, followed by a sound so faint at first that it was almost imperceptible. The unmistakable rustling of something crawling, moving within the walls. Sarah's eyes widened in terror. "Did you hear that?" Before Marlowe could respond, the floor groaned beneath their feet, and then, without warning, the wallpaper in front of them began to bulge outward, as though something was pressing from within. "Get back!" Marlowe shouted, pulling Sarah away from the wall. But it was already too late. The wallpaper ripped open with a deafening sound, and a flood of dark, viscous liquid poured out, splattering across the floor. The liquid was thick, almost like blood, and it hissed as it hit the cold floor. The team staggered back in shock, but it wasn't just the liquid that made their blood run cold. The substance was alive, writhing and undulating like some kind of grotesque organic mass. Marlowe felt his stomach churn as the liquid twisted and morphed, forming long, slimy tendrils that reached out from the wall as if hungry for something. Or someone. His heart pounded in his chest. "This isn't possible," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" Before anyone could answer, the wall itself seemed to shift, the veins beneath the wallpaper pulsing like a beating heart. The air grew warmer, thicker, and the house seemed to grow more alive with every passing second. The tendrils from the wall reached out, scraping against the floor, as if trying to pull something, or someone, into the depths of the house. Marlowe grabbed his flashlight and swung it toward the wall, his heart pounding. What he saw made his blood freeze. Where the wallpaper had been torn, there was now a mass of raw, fleshy tissue, tangled with veins and arteries, pulsing in sync with the house's unsettling rhythm. The tissue looked like a grotesque, living organism, its surface slick and shiny with some kind of fluid. "The house," Sarah murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "It's feeding." Marlowe's mind raced. "We need to get out. Now." But as he turned to lead the group toward the door, something in the air shifted. The door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping them inside. Marlowe cursed under his breath as the walls began to tremble. The house was alive, and it was locking them in. "We need to find another exit," Marlowe shouted. "Emma, check the other doors. Thomas, do you have any signal from the equipment?" But Emma's voice was thin with panic. "There's no way out. The walls—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes locked on the far corner of the room, where a new patch of wallpaper began to peel away on its own. A low, guttural noise filled the room, like a breath, but deeper and more resonant, like the very walls of the house were exhaling. The pulsating veins beneath the walls expanded, swelling with every breath. The very house seemed to be exhaling in slow, deliberate movements, the air thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. "We need to move, now!" Marlowe barked, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her away from the grotesque, writhing mass. But as they tried to retreat, the walls seemed to close in. The house was feeding, and it was drawing them closer, tightening its grip around them. The room grew hotter, the stench of decay and rot more overpowering. Sarah was the first to notice something strange. The tendrils had stopped moving. Instead, they were now solid, completely still. And that's when she realized the horrifying truth. The house wasn't just alive, it was hungry. A horrific, high-pitched scream filled the room, piercing their ears. It came from deep within the walls, a voice so tortured that it made the very air seem to vibrate with fear. It was a sound like nothing they had ever heard before, like the final, agonizing scream of a soul trapped within the walls for eternity. Sarah stumbled back, horrified. "It's feeding on us." The room seemed to darken as the house itself came to life, its walls pushing in from all sides, closing them in tighter. The pulsating mass of flesh and veins continued to writhe, and Marlowe could feel the air growing thin, the walls pressing in on them as if suffocating them. But then something even worse happened. The floor began to crack, the seams splitting open like the jaw of a monstrous beast, revealing what lay beneath. From the dark crevices of the house, something slithered up toward them. Something living, something hungry. The tendrils reached out again, but this time, they weren't just searching. They were grabbing, pulling, and pulling hard. The air in the mansion had grown thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls were alive, closing in around them. With each breath they took, it felt as though the house was taking one as well, its pulse rising in rhythm with their own. The once comforting sounds of the house, the creaking floors, the rustling of fabric, the soft hum of the wind outside, had all faded, replaced with an ominous silence that seemed to press against their eardrums. No longer were the walls merely breathing, they were alive. The trio of paranormal investigators, Jack, Maria, and Alex, stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, the flashlight beams flickering as though they too were nervous. Their bodies were tense, as if the house itself had wrapped around them, squeezing out all sense of comfort and replacing it with something far darker. "I don't think this is normal," Jack muttered, his voice shaky. He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his hand trembling slightly. He had been in plenty of haunted places before, but nothing like this. There was something wrong about this house, and it wasn't just the oppressive air. Maria, ever the skeptic, gritted her teeth. "We've been through worse. It's just an old house with some strange sounds." Alex, however, was no longer so sure. His gaze shifted uneasily to the walls. The wallpaper, which had been relatively harmless before, was no longer simply shifting. Now it moved. The undulating, pulsing patterns seemed to throb as if veins were pushing beneath the surface, crawling like the blood vessels in a living organism. His stomach churned, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. "Jack," Alex said, his voice strained, "I don't think we're alone here. There's something in those walls." Before Jack could respond, a low groaning sound echoed from above. It wasn't like the creaks of an old house settling. It was deeper, more guttural, as though something was moving in the attic. Something alive. Maria rolled her eyes. "It's probably just rats or—" Suddenly, a sharp, ear-splitting crack interrupted her words, followed by a deafening noise as the walls seemed to shudder violently. Jack staggered back, knocking over a chair in the process. The wall nearest them bulged outward like a grotesque, swelling tumor, pulsating as if some massive thing was struggling to break through. The sound was sickening, a wet, sucking noise followed by a deep, low hiss. "Get away from the walls!" Alex shouted, but it was too late. Without warning, a section of the wallpaper tore open with an agonizing sound, revealing an impossible sight. Raw, bloody tissue, pulsing and writhing beneath the surface. It was as though the house was breathing from the inside out, veins stretching across the walls like the flesh of some monstrous creature. The wallpaper tore further, revealing what seemed to be flesh. Flesh that was alive, breathing, and hungry. The very walls of the mansion had become a living organism, consuming everything it touched. Alex backed away, his breath shallow. Oh God, it's feeding on us." Jack and Maria had already started running, but the house wouldn't let them escape. The hallway stretched unnaturally, elongating as they moved, the walls tightening like a trap. The air grew thicker, the temperature plummeting as the house's sinister presence seemed to grow stronger, almost tangible. "Where's the exit?" Maria screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "The door! We're almost there!" Jack shouted, but the words felt hollow. They were nowhere near the door. The hallway they had been running down had expanded into an endless corridor, the walls now towering and dark. The house was playing tricks on them, distorting their sense of direction. It had already trapped them. Behind them, the sound of the walls breathing was getting louder, like the steady inhale and exhale of a monstrous beast. The flesh within the walls shifted, as if it were coming to life, hungry for their warmth, their flesh. A sound, almost like a low growl, rumbled from somewhere deep within the house, followed by the scrape of claws against wood. Something was moving within the walls, stalking them. "Keep moving!" Alex yelled, pushing Jack and Maria forward, though even he could feel the weight of dread settling over them. There was no escape. The house was too alive, too hungry. It was feeding on their fear, and it was starting to feed on their very bodies. Suddenly, the floor beneath them gave way with a deafening crack. Maria screamed as the ground opened up, swallowing her whole. Jack reached out, trying to grab her, but she vanished into the blackness below. "Maria!" Alex shouted, his heart racing in his chest. He leaned over the edge of the newly formed hole, but there was nothing to see, only darkness. "It's taking her! It's taking her!" Jack gasped, falling to his knees. He was shaking, his face pale with terror. He looked back toward the hallway, but the walls had started closing in, narrowing toward them like the jaws of a beast about to bite. Alex grabbed him by the arm. "We need to go. Now it's coming." The walls were closing in faster now, the thick, pulsing flesh within them churning violently as if it were hungry. They ran, but the hall seemed to stretch forever. The floorboards beneath their feet creaked and groaned, as if something was crawling just beneath, scraping its claws against the wood. Every step they took felt heavier, like they were being pulled backward by some unseen force. Finally, they reached a door they had passed by earlier, but hadn't noticed until now. They flung it open, hoping for a way out, but the sight that greeted them made their blood run cold. Inside was an enormous dark room. The walls here too were alive, pulsating with a grotesque organic tissue that seemed to throb to some twisted rhythm. But there was something else, something far worse. At the center of the room was a massive mass of flesh and bone, an enormous writhing creature that seemed to be made of the house itself. It was alive, its grotesque body forming and reforming as the walls fed into it. It was the house. It was the mansion's heart, and the house had been waiting for them. Before they could react, the ground beneath their feet split open again, and a long skeletal hand shot up from the blackness below, grabbing Alex by the ankle. He screamed, struggling to break free, but the fingers tightened, dragging him down. "Alex!" Jack cried out, reaching for him, but it was too late. The creature's tendrils snaked around him, pulling him into the abyss. The walls seemed to come alive with a frenzy, closing in, suffocating him with their hungry embrace. Jack was alone now. The house had claimed them both. He stumbled backward, his mind spinning, but the creature wasn't done. It was feeding now. The walls moved toward him, and he could feel the flesh around him pulling, twisting, suffocating. And then, as the walls closed in, he heard a whisper, a voice. It sounded almost familiar. "Join us." The air inside the mansion grew thick with an unnatural heaviness. The walls seemed to close in on them, pulsating with an eerie rhythm that echoed in their heads. As the investigators staggered backward, their breathing became shallow, hearts pounding in fear. "We need to get out," Emma gasped, her voice trembling. "There's no way out," Jonah said, his eyes wide with terror as he looked around. "The house is alive. It's feeding." A sickening, slurping sound came from the walls, followed by a low, guttural growl. The walls seemed to shift and move, as though they had grown hungry, as though they were reaching for them. The house was no longer an abandoned relic. It had become a living, breathing predator, its insatiable hunger now focused on the group standing in the heart of its lair. Desperate, Sarah pulled at her hair, her eyes darting around the room. "What do we do? We can't escape. We can't fight this. This thing, it wants us. It's been waiting for us." The room seemed to warp, the shadows lengthening and curling like black smoke. The wallpaper bubbled up, thick and swollen, as veins pulsed beneath the surface. What was once just a chilling decoration now appeared alive, a pulsating mass of organic tissue spreading over the walls like a disease. And now the wallpaper was beginning to slough off in chunks, revealing the raw, bloody mass underneath. "This isn't just a house," Jonah whispered, his voice barely a breath above a whisper. "It's a parasite. It feeds on us." The walls breathed deeper, the noise growing louder. It wasn't the house they had come to investigate anymore. It was a creature, alive and hungry, and it was trapping them in its maw. The investigators turned toward the doorway, but it had disappeared. In its place, a gaping hole in the wall opened like a mouth, its edges slick with blood. The walls around them seemed to close in, suffocating them, the air turning thick and heavy. "We need to get out of here! Now!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the noise. The deep, pulsing breath of the mansion, its hunger growing louder. Jonah backed into a corner, his hands trembling. "We've seen this before. The house can't just be alive. It has to have something inside of it." "It does," Emma said, her voice cracking with realization. "It's feeding on us. It has been all along. That's why it always looks abandoned. It doesn't need us until it does." The walls seemed to close in faster, and Jonah was the first to lose his nerve. He screamed and it echoed in every corner of the room, amplifying the terror. He grabbed the nearest object, a rusted chandelier, and swung it toward the wall. But the instant it made contact, the house recoiled as if it were alive. Jonah let out a sharp cry as the chandelier dropped from his hands, the very air around them seeming to become alive, attacking with all its strength. "We need to run," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. But the walls were shifting now, their veins expanding, their grotesque surfaces crawling with bloody tissue. The room was no longer a space. It was a living creature, pulsing and closing in on them. Their cries echoed through the mansion, absorbed by its hungry walls. Suddenly, the floor beneath them gave way. Jonah shrieked as he plummeted down, his body vanishing into the blackness below. Sarah lunged forward to grab him, but her hands only touched the slick, cold walls. She was pulled back violently as if the house had caught her in its jaws. "No!" Emma screamed, reaching out. But it was too late. Sarah's scream was swallowed up by the mansion as the walls tightened and the very air seemed to crush them. Emma looked at Jonah's empty spot, her heart pounding in her chest, then at the monstrous walls that continued to shift. The creature had claimed them. She was next. There was no escape. The last thing Emma saw was the pulsating veins of the mansion, the walls collapsing in around her. It was as though the house itself had won, devouring everything in its path, and it would continue to do so forever, feeding on the souls of those who dared to enter. Then everything went dark. Months later, investigators came to the mansion after hearing whispers about the disappearance of several paranormal experts. They found the mansion standing eerily silent. No signs of the investigation team anywhere. But in the dust-covered room, a subtle shift occurred. The wallpaper, once dark and unyielding, was now alive, pulsating with a thick, bloody hue. Something ancient stirred within the walls, and the scent of decay lingered, growing stronger by the hour. The house had fed once again, and it would continue to do so for as long as the walls still breathed. Story number 4. The mansion stood atop the hill, casting a long shadow over the sprawling estate below. Dark, brooding clouds gathered ominously above, as if the house itself was calling the storm. Its once beautiful facade now looked abandoned, the ivy creeping up its sides like the fingers of a long-forgotten ghost. The mansion had been the home of one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the city, Edward Blackwood, a tycoon whose power extended across many industries. His wealth, however, had been built on secrets, many of which had died with him. The mansion had a reputation, a dark one. People spoke in whispers about the tragic events that had occurred behind its closed doors, particularly the story of a woman named Amelia. Amelia had been a beautiful young woman when she first crossed paths with Edward Blackwood. She was not from wealth, not from power, but she had been captivating. Edward, accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, had been no exception to his own desires. He had swept her off her feet, making promises of a future full of luxury, love, and security. But as is often the case with men like him, once he had what he wanted, his affection turned cold. Amelia was not just his lover, she was his prisoner. It was on a cold autumn night that Edward Blackwood decided to make his true intentions known. He had kept Amelia in his mansion for months, showering her with gifts and attention. But the moment she realized his cruelty, it was already too late. He had lured her into the basement, promising a surprise. She had trusted him, at least she had once. But trust had its limits. The basement was not a place of grand design. It was a cold, damp, and suffocating room filled with forgotten things, old furniture, broken antiques, and cobwebs that reached into every corner. Amelia had barely stepped into the space when Edward locked the door behind her. She turned confused and called out to him, but he had already turned away. "Why are you doing this?" she had asked, her voice cracking with fear. Edward didn't respond. Instead, he walked to a nearby corner of the room where chains hung from the walls, rusted and old. It was there that he began to secure her, strapping her arms and legs to the cold, unforgiving stone. The chains were tight, and the metal bit into her skin. She struggled, but it was futile. Edward's strength was unmatched, and soon she found herself helpless, her cries echoing through the vast, empty house. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Edward. I don't understand. What have I done?" Edward did not answer. He simply left the room, locking the door behind him with a final definitive click. Amelia was alone. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Edward came and went, bringing food and water on occasion, but mostly ignoring her. He had chained her to the wall as though she were an animal, not a person. The slow passage of time wore away her spirit as much as it had her body. She became gaunt, her skin pale, and her once beautiful face became sunken and hollow, her eyes wide and filled with terror. The chains never left her wrists, never left her ankles. They were a constant reminder of her captivity. But it wasn't just the chains that tortured her. It was the silence, the darkness, the despair. And then, one day, it was over. Amelia died alone, in the basement of the mansion. Edward had left her there to rot, her life extinguished like a flame snuffed out by the wind. But death wasn't the end of Amelia's story. It was years before anyone thought to visit the mansion again. Edward Blackwood had died in a mysterious accident, a car crash on a lonely road, the details of which remained shrouded in mystery. His wealth was inherited by his distant relatives, and the mansion was left to gather dust. But there were rumors, whispers about strange happenings at the mansion, strange sounds, shadows that moved on their own, and an eerie chill that never seemed to leave the house. A small group of thrill seekers, urban explorers looking for a good story, decided to visit the mansion one cold winter's night. They had heard the rumors, the legends, and were eager to see for themselves. Liam, the leader of the group, was the first to descend into the basement. The others followed behind him, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls as they descended the creaking staircase. The basement was just as they had imagined, dark, damp, and filled with the smell of mildew. But there was something else, a presence, a weight in the air that none of them could shake. "This place gives me the creeps," one of the explorers, Katie, muttered. Liam didn't listen. He had been in worse places after all. But as he stepped further into the room, a chill ran down his spine. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very walls were closing in on him. "Let's go," Katie said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this." But it was too late. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The group turned to face the darkened room, their breaths quickening in fear. Something moved in the corner. The shadows twisted, pulling themselves into a figure. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, staring directly at them. Amelia's form was twisted, corrupted. The once beautiful face of the young lover had been replaced with the visage of something unearthly, a hollow shell of the woman she had once been. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her body appeared to flicker in and out of existence, as though she was not entirely real. Liam and the others froze, Fear overtook them as they watched her approach, her fingers long and bony, her skin like paper. "You shouldn't have come here," Amelia's voice whispered, her voice a hollow echo, like the wind howling through a long-forgotten grave. Before they could react, the shadows around her thickened, curling like tendrils, reaching for them. One by one, the explorers were pulled into the darkness, their screams echoing in the cold, empty mansion. But no one heard them. No one would ever find them again. The mansion, once a symbol of Edward Blackwood's power and wealth, now stood abandoned, a silent monument to a legacy of cruelty and torment. The echoes of Amelia's suffering had long since faded from the halls, but the house itself seemed to pulse with an energy, a memory of what had transpired within its walls. The walls were not just stone and wood. They were more. They were alive. The last visitors, the group of thrill seekers who had entered the mansion seeking adventure, had disappeared without a trace. The police had combed the surrounding areas, questioned locals, and searched the grounds, but no one had ever found any sign of them. The mansion had given up no secrets. It stood there like a sentinel, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and rotting wood. However, the legend of the mansion had not died. The whispers about the haunted house, the cursed basement, and the vengeful spirit of the woman who had once lived there continued to grow. People spoke in hushed tones about the mansion, daring each other to enter, but none ever did. Until one night, a young woman named Sarah, curious and unaware of the horrors that had taken place, found herself drawn to the mansion. It was the same mansion that had captivated so many before her. She had heard the rumors, the stories, but in her youthful arrogance, she didn't believe them. Sarah was an urban explorer, always seeking the next thrill, the next adventure, the next story to tell. The mansion was a perfect target. Sarah's friends had warned her. They knew the stories about the basement, about the whispers that came from within the house, about the eyes that seemed to follow anyone who entered. But Sarah was undeterred. She wanted to prove herself, to show her friends that she wasn't afraid of ghost stories. "I'll be fine," Sarah had said, her voice dripping with confidence. "I'll just take a few pictures and be back in an hour." Her friends, though nervous, couldn't stop her. They watched as she approached the mansion, the chill in the air suddenly becoming unbearable. The wind howled, making the trees shake, but Sarah pressed on. She entered the mansion through a broken window, the glass crunching beneath her feet as she stepped inside. The air was heavy, thick with dust and the smell of decay. The house was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and makes you question whether the place is truly empty. Every step she took was met with creaks and groans of the old house, as though it was waking up from a long slumber. Sarah wandered through the darkened halls, her flashlight flickering as it illuminated the decrepit furniture and faded wallpaper. She snapped pictures with her camera, documenting the eerie beauty of the mansion. As she made her way to the basement door, she could feel her heart race in anticipation. She had to see the infamous basement, the place where the spirit of the mistress was said to reside. The basement door creaked open with a slow, groaning sound as she pushed against it. The air down below was colder than the rest of the house, and a damp, musty smell wafted up from the darkness. Her flashlight cast a faint, wavering light down the stairs, but the shadows seemed to dance, flickering and twisting. The moment she set foot on the stairs, she felt it, a presence. It was subtle at first, like a shiver down her spine, but then it grew stronger, more oppressive. The house was watching her. "Hello," she called out into the darkness, her voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone here?" Her words echoed off the walls, but there was no response. She descended further into the basement, her steps cautious now. At the bottom, she paused. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing a large open room. The walls were lined with old furniture and forgotten relics, much of it covered in dust. But there was something else, a strange feeling in the air. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing, shifting, waiting. Suddenly she saw it, a dark shape in the corner of the room. It was as if the shadows had taken form, twisting and writhing, coalescing into a figure. Sarah froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure in the corner was not human, not in the way she had expected. It was something else. A shape, a shadow, but it had a presence. It was there, and it was watching her. And then, the whisper came. It was faint at first, like the sound of wind through a cracked window. But as the figure grew clearer, so did the voice. "Help me!" The voice was soft, desperate, tinged with an unbearable sorrow. It echoed through the room, reverberating in Sarah's mind. The figure in the corner took a step forward, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman before her was no longer human. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, empty, as though she had been drained of everything that made her alive. Her mouth opened again, and the whisper became a scream. "Help me!" The scream pierced the air, reverberating in Sarah's mind, rattling her thoughts. It was so loud, so full of anguish, that it seemed to shake the walls themselves. The room around her began to distort, the walls bending inward, the shadows growing longer, more insistent. The woman in front of her reached out with skeletal hands, her fingers curling like claws. Sarah stumbled backward, her heart racing, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. The room was no longer just a basement. It was something else. It was a trap, a place where the house fed on fear and sorrow, where the past and present collided, and where Amelia's suffering had never ended. Who are you?" Sarah gasped, her voice shaking with fear. The woman's head tilted to the side, her hollow eyes never leaving Sarah. "I am the one who was forgotten," she whispered, her voice low and haunting. "The one who was betrayed. I am Amelia." Before Sarah could react, the shadows surged forward, wrapping around her, pulling her toward the center of the room. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if the house itself was alive, hungry. The air thickened and the temperature dropped further. The walls seemed to contract, closing in on her. Sarah screamed, but it was drowned out by the echoing cry of Amelia's spirit. The basement walls began to close in tighter, the room growing smaller, suffocating. Amelia's voice rang in Sarah's ears, each word more chilling than the last. "You shouldn't have come here." The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness consumed her was Amelia's face, a twisted reflection of anguish, guilt, and rage. And then everything went black. The house creaked with an unsettling rhythm, as though breathing in time with the pounding of Sarah's heart. She had made the decision, foolish as it seemed, to venture deeper into the mansion, beyond the confines of the opulent rooms that betrayed no hint of the horrors lurking in its shadows. But the basement called to her with a primal force she couldn't ignore. Her flashlight quivered in her hand, casting erratic beams of light across the narrow corridor leading to the stairs. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The whispers from the other rooms had grown louder, more distinct. Sarah's mind raced with the stories she had uncovered. Amelia's brutal fate, her imprisonment, her torment, and the chilling finality of her death at the hands of the very man who once professed to love her. "Why am I doing this?" Sarah muttered to herself. But even as the words escaped her lips, her feet carried her forward. The stairs down to the basement were steep and narrow, their edges jagged as though the stone had been worn by centuries of suffering. Each step she took was accompanied by the sickening sound of her shoes scraping against the stone, like a prelude to something far worse. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah stood before a rusted iron door, the cold metal breathing with a life of its own. She hesitated, the hairs on her neck standing up as an overwhelming sense of dread settled over her. But there was no turning back now. The truth was within her reach. She had to know what happened in this forsaken place. With a shaky breath, Sarah pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, and the smell hit her like a wall, sour, fetid, almost metallic. The basement was dark, save for the faint glow of her flashlight, and her gaze immediately fell upon the center of the room. There, chained to the stone wall, was a figure. It was Amelia, but not as Sarah had imagined her. The woman's once beautiful face was twisted into a grotesque mask of agony, skin drawn tight over bone, her eyes hollow and empty. Her body was a sickly shade of gray, and her long matted hair hung limply around her face. The chains that bound her were covered in rust. like the ones that had kept her prisoner in this hell for what must have felt like an eternity. Amelia's lips parted, and a low, guttural moan echoed through the room. But it wasn't the sound of a broken woman, it was the sound of pure rage. Sarah's breath hitched as she stepped forward, unable to tear her eyes away from the horrifying spectacle before her. Amelia's gaze slowly shifted toward her, and in that instant, Sarah felt her chest tighten with an indescribable terror. The woman's eyes burned with fury, but there was something more, a hunger, a thirst for vengeance. "I see you've come for me," Amelia whispered, her voice a harsh rasp that reverberated through Sarah's bones. "But you don't know what you've awakened." Before Sarah could respond, the room seemed to shift around her, the walls pressing in as though the house itself was alive, suffocating her with its presence. The chains rattled, and Amelia's mouth curled into a vicious grin, showing jagged teeth that didn't belong to a human. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, the darkness becoming heavier, almost suffocating. Shadows seemed to stretch toward Sarah, reaching out with twisted, clawed fingers. Suddenly, Amelia's chains snapped, and with unnatural speed, she lunged forward, her body a blur of grotesque motion. Sarah stumbled backward, heart racing, as the woman's ghostly figure collided with her, throwing her to the cold stone floor. Amelia's breath was hot against Sarah's face as the woman loomed over her, her nails scraping the floor like claws. Sarah could feel her icy breath, hear the tortured whispers in the air, and smell the decaying stench of the woman's flesh. Amelia's eyes locked onto hers, filled with an insatiable rage that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "You don't get to leave," Amelia growled, her voice dripping with venom. "Not until you've seen what I've become." The room around Sarah began to close in. The walls trembled as if the house itself was alive, the once still wallpaper now pulsating with an unnatural life, as though veins ran beneath the surface. The breath of the house filled her ears, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, or perhaps something much darker. Desperation surged through Sarah's veins as she struggled to free herself from Amelia's vice-like grip. The woman's shadowy form seemed to merge with the darkness of the room, feeding on the very air around them. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting distorted shadows that seemed to twist and writhe as though the walls themselves were alive, pulsing with hunger. Suddenly, a sharp pain exploded across Sarah's chest, and she gasped, looking down to see a dark stain spreading across her shirt. Blood? No, there were no wounds. It was something else, something far worse. Amelia's figure blurred, and with a sickening screech, the shadows around them seemed to swallow the room whole. Sarah's senses were overwhelmed. Her head spun, her heart raced, and the room seemed to bend and twist like the inside of a living creature. Then in the sudden, oppressive silence, Amelia's voice echoed in her mind, a whisper so soft, it felt like it came from within her own thoughts. "Now you're mine." In a final, nightmarish moment, the walls began to close in on Sarah, the once sturdy foundation now pulsing with the same hunger that had consumed Amelia. The shadows constricted tighter and tighter, wrapping around Sarah's body, suffocating her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her vision blurred as the room swallowed her whole. The mansion seemed to breathe around her, suffocating, tightening, until Sarah was nothing more than a part of it. Her spirit, her essence, her very soul, claimed by the walls that had fed on so many others before her. And Amelia's laughter echoed in the distance, a chilling, hollow sound that would haunt the mansion forever. Story number 5. In the remote village of Immerse, hidden deep within a mist-laden valley, stood a mansion whose dark silhouette was etched against the ever-dimming sky. The Blackwell Mansion, a grand structure that had once been the epitome of wealth and refinement, now lay in ruin. Time and neglect had done their work on the house, and the whispers of its ominous past hung over it like a curse. The mansion was perched high on a craggy hill, looming above the village as though watching over the small, isolated community. A place where shadows stretched long, even in the brightest of days. The villagers of Elder Mist rarely spoke of the mansion. To most of them, it was a place to avoid. The stories about it, passed down from generation to generation, were enough to keep them at bay. Rumors about the mansion's haunted history had spread like wildfire, about the twisted nature of the Blackwell family, the disappearances, and most terrifying of all, the mirror. The mirror of madness, as it had come to be called, was said to hold a terrible power. No one could confirm the true extent of its evil, but the villagers had learned long ago to fear the mansion and its dark reflection. The mansion had once been home to the affluent Blackwell family, whose wealth came from their extensive estate and a lucrative trade in antiques. However, the family's prosperity had come to a sudden and inexplicable end when all members mysteriously disappeared without a trace. Theories of murder, betrayal, and foul play circulated for years, but no solid answers ever emerged. The mansion, once alive with activity, had become nothing more than a decaying shell of its former self. But within the house was something far more sinister than any rumor could convey. A mirror, unlike any other. It was said to stand in the grand hallway, so large it seemed to swallow the entire room in its reflective surface. No one knew where the mirror had come from or why it had been placed there, but legend said that those who gazed into it saw more than just their reflection. The house, with its decaying walls and floorboards that creaked beneath every step, had a living presence, something that fed on the people who dared to enter its walls. Despite the warnings and the stories of madness, there were those who could not resist the allure of the mansion's mystery. Ethan Price, a renowned paranormal investigator, was one of those men. Ethan had spent years chasing after the unknown. He had uncovered hidden histories of haunted houses, restless spirits, and cursed objects. But something about the Blackwell mansion intrigued him more than any other case. The stories, the whispered tales of the mirror's powers, the strange disappearances. It all beckoned him like a puzzle he couldn't resist solving. And so, with his team of experts, Ethan had come to Eldermist, ready to unlock the secrets of the mansion once and for all. The air was thick with fog as Ethan and his team arrived at the base of the hill. Their car's headlights barely pierced the dense mist, and as they ascended the winding road, a chill seemed to creep into their bones. It wasn't just the temperature. There was something about this place that felt wrong. The town was eerily quiet, and the houses they passed looked as though they had been abandoned for years, despite evidence of life inside. There was no sign of life on the streets, no children playing, no merchants haggling, just an oppressive silence. "Can you feel that?" Sarah, the team's medium, asked softly. She sat next to Ethan, her eyes darting nervously out the window. "It's like the land itself is watching us." Ethan nodded but said nothing. He could sense it too, something heavy, like a weight pressing down on him. The mansion stood at the top of the hill, a dark figure against the fog that made the night feel eternal. It seemed to draw them closer with every turn of the wheels, until the car finally stopped in front of the massive iron gates that led into the estate. As the team gathered their equipment, Ben, the skeptic scientist, stretched his arms and muttered under his breath, "A haunted house. Great. Just what I need." He adjusted his glasses and looked up at the mansion. "You do realize we're here to investigate a glorified ghost story, right? There's nothing special about this place." Sarah gave him a sharp look. If only it were that simple. Marissa, the historian, stood a few feet away, gazing up at the mansion with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The Blackwell family's history is as tragic as it is mysterious. They say this house was a haven for wealthy elites, but something went horribly wrong. No one ever found out what happened to them, what happened to anyone who stayed in this place. "All the more reason to investigate," Ethan replied, checking the gear in his backpack. He had heard the stories, of course, and although he wasn't one to believe in ghosts or curses, there was something different about this place. It wasn't just a house, it was a force. The locals didn't speak of it directly, but they were terrified of it. Terrified of the mirror, the one artifact that had somehow survived the family's downfall. The mansion's gates creaked as they pushed them open, the iron groaning like a living thing in pain. Stepping onto the overgrown grounds, the team made their way up the cobbled path toward the main door, which stood ajar as if inviting them inside. The mansion looked like it had been abandoned for decades, yet the air felt thick with a strange, oppressive energy. Inside, the house was colder than expected. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the faint smell of mildew and decay hung in the air. Dust particles swirled in the light of their flashlights, and the once grand staircase leading up to the upper floors was now barely more than a skeletal structure, its banisters eaten away by time and neglect. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling in places like the house itself was shedding its skin. "Look at this place," Marissa said, running her fingers along the faded wallpaper. "It's as if time itself has forgotten about it." Ethan was scanning the room, his eyes moving over every inch of the space, but his focus was on the hallway at the end of the room. There, standing like a silent sentinel, was the mirror. Even from this distance, he could see its size, the way it stretched almost the length of the hallway. The edges of the frame were gilded with what appeared to be ornate carvings, but even in the dim light, Ethan could tell there was something off about it. Something wrong. "That's it," he said softly, nodding toward the mirror. "That's the one." The group walked cautiously toward the grand object, the air growing colder with each step. As they approached, Sarah's expression darkened, her usual calm demeanor replaced with visible unease. "I can feel it, the energy coming from it. It's alive, watching us." Ben scoffed, but there was a slight tremor in his voice. "Alive? You've got to be kidding me. It's just a mirror." Marissa reached the mirror first, and despite the warnings that hung in the air, she placed her hand gently against the frame. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice almost reverent, "but there's something about it odd." Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from the mirror. The more he looked at it, the more he felt as though it were pulling him in, urging him to step closer. His reflection in the mirror was blurry, as though the glass was slightly fogged. But as he drew nearer, he saw something that sent a chill running through his spine. For a split second, his reflection moved before he did, its head tilting unnaturally to the side, as if it had its own thoughts. "That's it," Sarah whispered. "That's what they all saw." Ethan stepped back, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" Sarah's eyes locked onto the mirror as she stepped closer to it. "The mirror doesn't just reflect reality. It shows you your darkest fears. The parts of you that you can't hide, the things you don't want to face." For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. But he was here to investigate, to uncover the truth. "Let's see what it shows then," he muttered, stepping up to the mirror, his hand hovering over its surface. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as it hovered just inches from the cold, smooth surface of the mirror. The chill in the air had thickened around them, as though the very room itself was holding its breath. Sarah's warning echoed in his mind, but his determination was stronger. He had come here to uncover the truth, to peel back the layers of myth and superstition, and reveal what was hiding in the shadows. Ben the skeptic was already impatient. "Come on, Ethan, stop being dramatic," he muttered, rolling his eyes. "It's just a mirror. We're wasting time." Marissa stood beside the mirror, her face pale and tense, her eyes never leaving the glass. "You don't understand, Ben," she said softly. "This mirror isn't just a reflection of the outside world. It's something more. It shows things distorted." She glanced at Ethan, her voice trembling. "It shows the truth, but the truth isn't always something you can handle." Ethan exhaled, his breath visible in the freezing air. The room felt colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in around them. With a deep breath, he finally pressed his fingers against the surface of the mirror, the coolness of the glass sending a shiver down his spine. At first, nothing happened. The surface was smooth, unyielding. His reflection stared back at him, as normal as ever. But then, just as his fingers made contact, his reflection shifted. The glass rippled like the surface of a pool, disturbed by a stone, and the room seemed to darken, as if the light itself were sucked into the mirror's depths. Ethan jerked his hand back, his heart pounding. He stumbled backward, knocking into Marissa, who let out a sharp gasp. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, the air thick with an unnatural weight. He blinked, trying to regain his bearings, but something was wrong. His reflection was no longer still. The figure staring back at him in the glass was moving. At first, it was subtle, a twitch of the hand, the slightest tilt of the head. But as Ethan's gaze locked onto his own reflection, he saw it move without him. The figure in the mirror was tilting its head at an unnatural angle, staring at Ethan with eyes that were wide and unblinking. The reflection smiled, but it was a twisted, grotesque grin that didn't belong to him. Ethan's pulse quickened. He reached out, his hand shaking. What the hell? Sarah took a step back, her eyes wide. It's alive, she whispered. It's not just a reflection. It's something else. Ben rolled his eyes, but there was a noticeable tremor in his voice. All right, enough with the theatrics. We're here to investigate, not get spooked by a piece of glass. But even Ben's bravado couldn't mask the unease that had settled in the room. Ethan's reflection, still grinning unnaturally, began to move more aggressively now. It raised one hand, pressing it against the mirror's surface. Ethan instinctively stepped back, but the reflection did not follow. Instead, it stayed fixed in place, its hand now pressed flat against the mirror, as though it were trying to push its way out. Suddenly, the air grew cold, unnaturally cold. Ethan felt it bite into his skin, a deep, frigid chill that gnawed at his bones. The light in the room flickered once, twice, and then the candles extinguished completely, plunging them into darkness. Panic crept in as they fumbled for their flashlights, their breaths visible in the freezing air. What the hell is happening? Marissa gasped, her voice shaky. This isn't just a reflection. It's something else. The mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating noise that seemed to pulse through the walls. The sound was alien, unnatural, as if the mirror itself was alive, breathing. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, as though the mansion itself were shifting around them. The shadows in the room stretched longer, warping like living things, crawling toward them as if the darkness itself had a life of its own. Ethan's flashlight flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows across the walls, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn that the reflection in the mirror was not his own anymore. The twisted figure was now pressing both hands against the glass, its face contorted into something unrecognizable, its eyes wide and dark, staring into his soul. He reached for his own flashlight, his fingers trembling as he turned it on. The beam of light fell across the reflection, and then stopped. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was wrong. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart racing. The reflection in the mirror no longer resembled him at all. It was a nightmarish version of himself, an evil version with a cruel, twisted smile and eyes that burned with an intensity that made his stomach churn. The figure in the glass was moving, reaching out toward him, its fingers stretching impossibly long as though it were trying to escape. And then with a sudden and sickening crack, the mirror's surface began to ripple like water. The glass twisted and warped, its surface buckling as though it were no longer solid. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the reflection seemed to push against the glass, the figure inside now pressing forward, as though trying to crawl out of the mirror itself. "Get back!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The twisted figure lunged forward. In an instant, the mirror exploded in a shower of shards, a deafening crash that sent everyone sprawling to the floor. The glass fragments sparkled in the air, reflecting the dim light of their flashlights in every direction. But among the chaos, one thing stood out. The figure from the mirror had come through. It was no longer just a reflection. The creature, or whatever it was, now stood in front of them, its body half-formed, a grotesque mockery of Ethan's own image. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth, that smile twisted and cruel, stretched impossibly wide. Ethan's stomach churned with revulsion as the creature moved toward them, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, jerking like a puppet. It made no sound except for the faint, guttural rasp of its breath, if it could even be called breath. "Whoosh! What the hell is that thing?" Ben stammered, backing away. The creature's gaze turned to him, locking onto him with an unholy intensity. Its lips parted, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. Then it spoke, its voice low and guttural, the words crawling up Ethan's spine like 1,000 spiders. "You shouldn't have come. Before they could react, the creature lunged, its long fingers shooting out toward Ben. Screams filled the air as the figure grabbed him, its claws sinking into his skin. Ben flailed, but his screams were drowned out by the sound of tearing flesh. In a matter of seconds, he was dragged toward the creature's twisted form, his body sinking into its unnatural embrace. As he disappeared into the creature's grip, Ethan's flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the room. It was too late to save him, and with that horrifying realization, the group's fate was sealed. The mansion had become more than just a decaying structure. It was a force, alive with a presence that seemed to gnaw at the edges of their sanity. Each step the team took, each creaking floorboard under their feet, echoed as if the house itself was breathing in time with them. And then there was the mirror, always watching, always waiting. "I can't shake this feeling," Sarah murmured as she stared at the grand mirror that dominated the room, its frame as dark as the shadows themselves. The rest of the group had reluctantly gathered around it, and the more they stared into its depths, the more they felt something pulling at their minds, coaxing them deeper into its reflection. Jacob stepped forward, his fingers twitching as if something were beckoning him closer. His reflection seemed to smile back at him, but it wasn't the simple smile of a person. It was distorted, predatory, like a hungry wolf. "Don't look at it," Daniel warned, his voice a hushed whisper. "It's playing tricks. We need to get out of here." But it was already too late. Jacob's eyes were fixed on his reflection, watching as it moved ever so slightly, as if it had a life of its own. His fingers, without his own consent, began to reach for the glass. I think I can touch it," Jacob said, his voice low, almost hypnotic. Before anyone could stop him, Jacob's fingers brushed against the cold surface of the mirror. His reflection mirrored the movement perfectly, but then it didn't. The figure in the mirror smiled wider, too wide. Its face began to distort, stretching unnaturally, its eyes turning black as coal. "No!" Sarah screamed. "Jacob, stop!" But it was too late. The air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with an oppressive force that weighed down on their lungs. Sarah reached for Jacob, but his body jerked back as if pulled by an invisible hand. His scream was muffled as his entire form seemed to stretch toward the glass. The team rushed forward, trying to pull him away from the mirror, but it was as if they were trying to pull him from a black hole. Then with a sickening crack, Jacob was yanked into the mirror. The force was so violent that the frame of the mirror shook, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Time itself felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Jacob's body, no longer fully his, now rested within the reflection, his limbs contorted in unnatural ways. He looked at them with wide eyes, his mouth agape in a silent scream, begging for release. But the reflection was no longer Jacob. The mirrored version of him grinned, a twisted, hollow grin, as though savoring the terror it had just created. The team stared in horror as it winked at them, an unnatural, mocking gesture that sent a chill down their spines. "Get him out!" Sarah choked out, her hands trembling as she reached for the mirror. But the reflection of Jacob began to move once again. It wasn't just a reflection, it was a prison, a place where the lost souls were trapped, their forms distorted and twisted by whatever horrors the mirror had seen. Daniel was the first to react. He pulled a crowbar from his backpack and swung it at the glass. The loud clang rang through the room, but the mirror barely cracked. It was as if it were made of something other than glass, a living thing that absorbed every blow. The cracks spider-webbed across the surface, but it didn't break. It resisted. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "We need to get him back." The reflection of Jacob's face contorted into something grotesque, its features stretching impossibly, and then it reached back. The hand from the mirror, a skeletal, clawed thing, shot out and grabbed Jacob's arm. He screamed as the glass rippled, distorting, like liquid. The hand pulled him deeper, his body warping with every inch it was dragged into the mirror. "No!" Sarah screamed. She tried to reach for him, but the mirror was pulling him in faster now, like a hungry beast. Then the reflection of Jacob's face started to shift. It was no longer him. It was something else. Something dark. Something wrong. The figure in the mirror began to claw at the glass, desperately trying to reach out to her. Sarah screamed, "What is that?" It wasn't Jacob. It was something far more terrifying, a thing that was born from the mirror, something ancient and malevolent, hungry for more than just his body. It was seeking souls, feeding off the terror it inspired. Suddenly, the mirror cracked in a violent, splintering explosion. Pieces of glass fell to the floor, shattering everywhere. But the image of Jacob's tortured face was still there, suspended in the shards. It was as though the mirror itself was screaming with him, but it was a sound that only they could hear, echoing in their minds. Then the room fell silent. Jacob was gone. The mirror was no more. And yet, there was something left behind. "He's gone," Daniel muttered, his voice hollow. His face was pale, his hands shaking. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was staring at the shards on the floor. There, in the broken pieces of glass, she saw them. The faces of the people who had looked into the mirror before, the souls trapped within, their faces contorted in endless torment, mouths open in eternal screams. And then, one of those faces, her face, smiled back at her. It wasn't her reflection, though. It was something else, something darker. She stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection she saw wasn't her. It was the twisted version of herself. Her eyes were hollow, her lips were stretched in an unsettling grin. She reached out to touch the glass, her fingers shaking in horror. "Sarah!" A whispering voice called from behind her. It was Jacob, but it wasn't him. It was the mirror, the thing that had taken him. The voice grew louder, the whisper becoming a growl, as something cold and dark wrapped around her. It was dragging her into the glass, into the darkness, into the endless void of madness. Before she could scream, the last thing she saw was her own reflection, grinning at her as if it had already won. Story number 6. The old mansion stood like a decaying monument to tragedy, its dark silhouette etched against the stormy sky. Its once majestic windows were now cracked, their glass jagged and dull, and the stone walls, once pristine, were now coated in grime, the cracks in them like old, tired scars. The house had been abandoned for decades, but it still loomed over the surrounding land, a place where light dared not linger, where the air itself felt thick with forgotten memories and untold horrors. Despite the mansion's disrepair, the whispers had never stopped. It was the nursery, they said, the room behind the locked doors, where the terrible events had transpired. Those who had dared venture near the mansion spoke of it with fear in their eyes and tremors in their voices. The mansion's dark secret was not in its rotting walls or its dust-covered floors, but in the room that no one had entered in years, a room where time had stopped, where the echoes of a mother's grief and her desperate desire to bring life back to her dead child still lingered, trapped in the folds of the air. The nursery was the heart of the mansion's curse, and no one had ever returned from it unscathed. Sarah, a young journalist, had heard the stories. She had spent her entire life chasing after the supernatural, investigating the world's most haunted locations, and writing stories that captivated her audience. But even she felt a chill crawl down her spine when she first received the letter. The letter had come unexpectedly, an invitation to explore the mansion and uncover its secrets. It was signed by the estate's current owner, a reclusive man named William Cross, who had inherited the mansion after the mysterious death of his uncle. The letter promised a story more twisted than any Sarah had encountered before, something that would solidify her career as the world's foremost paranormal investigator. Despite her usual skepticism, Sarah couldn't resist the allure of the story. She packed her bags, grabbed her camera and notebooks, and set off for the mansion. The journey to Cross Manor was long and grueling. The narrow road leading to the mansion was overgrown with vines, and the trees seemed to bend and stretch toward the vehicle, blocking out the sunlight as if trying to keep her from entering. When she finally reached the estate, the mansion appeared to be even more decrepit than she had imagined. Its towers loomed like skeletal fingers, reaching into the sky. The iron gate that once stood tall and imposing was now rusted and bent, and the entire property was overrun with weeds and ivy. William Cross greeted her at the door, a tall man with hollowed cheeks and a distant look in his eyes. There was a strange air about him, as though the weight of his family's history had crushed the life out of him. He welcomed her with a quiet politeness, though there was something in his demeanor that made Sarah feel uneasy. "The nursery," he said, leading her through the dimly lit hallway, his voice low. "It is where it all began. I must warn you, Miss Davis, it is not a place for the faint of heart." Sarah nodded, her curiosity piqued. She was used to haunted places, used to the eerie silence of abandoned buildings and the strange occurrences that followed her wherever she went. But she had never encountered a place quite like this. William led Sarah through a labyrinth of corridors, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew clung to the walls. The mansion had clearly been abandoned for years, but in the depths of the house, it felt as though time had stopped altogether. Finally, they reached the door to the nursery. It was at the end of a narrow hallway, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the house. The door was old, its wood cracked and warped, as though it had been untouched for generations. A rusty iron key was placed in the lock, and William hesitated before turning it. "This room has been sealed for a reason," he muttered, almost to himself. "Once you enter, you may not leave the same." Sarah felt her heart race as the door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and the remnants of something long forgotten. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, stained and torn in places. The ceiling was covered in mold, and the once beautiful chandelier hung crookedly, its crystals cracked and dull. The furniture in the room was old, almost antique. An ornate crib, a rocking chair, a small wooden chest, all coated in dust and cobwebs. But it was the crib that caught Sarah's attention. It was placed in the center of the room, draped in an eerie, faded canopy. The mattress inside was stained and covered in mold, and the sheets were a sickly shade of yellow. But it wasn't the crib that sent a shiver down her spine. It was what she could hear. From the moment she entered the room, there was a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was a faint cry, like the whimper of an infant, too quiet to be real, but loud enough to send a chill through her bones. The cry seemed to come from within the walls, as though the house itself was mourning something long gone. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. William's face grew pale. "It's the baby," he said, his voice breaking, "or what's left of it." As Sarah walked closer to the crib, she felt a sudden coldness in the air, like an unseen hand brushing against her skin. The cries grew louder, more distinct, but still distant, as though they were coming from behind a veil. She reached out to touch the crib, but before her fingers could make contact, she saw something, a shadow dark and elongated, flickering on the floor beside her. Suddenly, the cry stopped. Sarah turned to look at William, but he was gone. The room was empty, save for the crib and the faint sound of breathing, a low, rattling noise coming from behind her. A sharp, skeletal hand shot out from the crib, its bony fingers scraping across the wooden floor, reaching for Sarah. Sarah recoiled, stumbling backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She scrambled for the door, her breath ragged, but before she could make it out, the door slammed shut on its own. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls creaking, the air thickening with an oppressive force that made it hard to breathe. The ghostly cries began again, louder this time, as though the child were wailing directly in her ear. But as she looked around, there was no child, only shadows and decay. She turned back to the crib, her pulse racing. The skeletal hand was now joined by another, and then another, until they were all reaching out toward her, their fingers twitching as they tried to pull her into the crib. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive, feeding on her fear. Suddenly, the air grew cold, colder than anything she had ever experienced, and the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed in the room. Sarah spun around, only to find herself face to face with a figure, pale, gaunt, and dressed in tattered black clothing. It was a woman, but her eyes were empty sockets, her face twisted in a grotesque expression of agony. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered, her voice hollow, barely more than a breath. With a scream, Sarah lunged toward the door, but the woman's skeletal hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a strength that defied her fragile form. Sarah struggled, trying to pull free, but the grip was ironclad. And then she saw it. The woman's mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears, a thunderous drumbeat that drowned out everything else. The woman's skeletal grip tightened around her wrist, cold and unforgiving. With every inch Sarah tried to pull away, the woman's fingers seemed to burrow deeper into her skin, as though they were seeking something inside her very soul. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered again, her voice carrying a sorrowful echo that seemed to seep into the walls themselves. The room was alive with a pulse, as if the house were feeding off her terror. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to succumb to the fear. This was what she came here for, the truth behind the haunted mansion, the mystery of the nursery. But nothing could have prepared her for the horrors that lurked within. She drew her free hand to her side, reaching for the flashlight she had tucked into her coat pocket. With a sudden burst of strength, Sarah twisted her wrist, causing the woman's grip to slacken for just a fraction of a second. She yanked her arm free, stumbling back as she pointed the flashlight toward the woman's twisted form. The beam of light revealed a nightmarish visage. The woman's body was a grotesque, withering shell, her flesh hanging in tatters from her bones. Her eyes, empty black pits, seemed to draw in the light, absorbing it like a void. Her mouth hung open impossibly wide, its teeth sharp and jagged, dripping with some foul, viscous substance. "You cannot leave," the woman growled, her voice now an unnatural, guttural rasp that echoed off the walls. "Not until the child is free." The walls around Sarah began to quake, and a sickening, gurgling sound reverberated through the room, as if something, or someone, was stirring beneath the floorboards. The crib seemed to tremble, the moldy sheets rustling like dry paper. The shadows grew longer, thicker, as if they had a life of their own, slithering along the walls toward her. "Let me go," Sarah cried, struggling to maintain control over her fear, her voice shaking as the weight of the atmosphere pressed in on her. She pointed the flashlight to the door, but it remained shut, the handle immovable. The woman's hollow eyes glared at her, and she stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural. "The child has waited too long," she crooned, reaching for Sarah's throat with a twisted hand. "The rituals, the curse, it must be completed." Sarah's stomach lurched as she realized the terrible truth. The woman, a ghost or something worse, was not just a victim of the mansion's curse. She was part of it. She was bound to the nursery, to the child, and Sarah had unwittingly walked into the middle of a ritual that had gone terribly wrong. The house, the nursery, the child, they were all connected by a force far beyond her understanding. "Please," Sarah begged, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't know what you want from me." The woman's grin widened grotesquely, and she dragged her bony fingers down her own face, peeling away the remnants of skin in jagged strips. Blood oozed from the raw wounds, but the woman didn't seem to notice. The blood was black, thick, and viscous, pooling at her feet like tar. "The child will be free, one way or another," the woman hissed, "and you will be the key." Sarah took a step back, but the shadows swarmed around her, encasing her in a suffocating blanket of darkness. The flashlight flickered, casting strange, distorted shadows across the room. The crib seemed to writhe, the moldy sheets undulating as if alive. A low growl emanated from beneath the floorboards, and the room seemed to close in on her. She could feel the pressure in the air, a coldness so intense it burned her skin. It was as though the house itself was breathing, pulsing with malevolent intent. The woman's voice dropped to a low, rasping whisper. "The child will claim what is rightfully hers. You will feed her. All of you will feed her." Before Sarah could comprehend what was happening, the floor beneath her feet gave way with a loud crack. She fell, tumbling into the darkness below, her body slamming against something hard and cold. She tried to cry out, but the air was knocked from her lungs. When Sarah opened her eyes, she found herself in a new chamber, one that felt even older, more suffocating. The walls here were blackened, slick with some oily substance, and the stench of decay was overwhelming. She could hear the sound of dripping water, though there was no visible source. Her flashlight lay a few feet away, still flickering weakly. She crawled toward it, her heart pounding in her chest. But as her fingers closed around the handle, a sound broke through the air. The soft, mournful cry of a baby. The cry echoed through the chamber, coming from the far corner of the room. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she slowly turned to face the source of the noise. In the shadows, something stirred. Something small, something alive. A baby, or something that resembled a baby. Its body was twisted, its skin pale and slick with mucus. Its eyes were wide, pitch black, and they seemed to lock onto Sarah as it crawled toward her, dragging itself across the floor with unnatural speed. It let out a gurgling, inhuman cry, its mouth stretching into a grotesque, twisted grin. "No, no," Sarah whispered, backing away slowly, her heart racing. She was trapped in the nightmare, surrounded by shadows and echoes of madness. The child, or whatever it was reaching for her, its skeletal hands outstretched, its teeth glistening in the dim light. The woman's voice echoed in the room, louder now, as if it were coming from all around her. "Feed her," the voice demanded. "Feed her, or be consumed." The room seemed to shake as the walls pulsated once again, a rhythmic, sickening throb that made Sarah's skin crawl. Her eyes darted around in panic, searching for an escape. But the more she struggled, the more the walls closed in on her, the more the shadows seemed to consume the light. The baby, it was crawling toward her, its gurgling cries becoming more insistent, more desperate. It wasn't a baby. It was something far worse, something born of this cursed place, something that demanded to be fed. And Sarah understood the terrible truth. It wasn't just the woman who had been bound to this nursery. The child, this monstrous, deformed thing, was a part of the curse, a creation of twisted rituals and desperation. And now Sarah was part of it too. She was to feed it, to become part of its dark, insatiable hunger. As the child reached out for her, its claws grazing her skin, Sarah screamed. Just as the walls closed in, swallowing her whole. The nursery was silent again. The crib sat undisturbed, and outside the mansion, the wind howled against the crumbling stone walls. Another victim claimed by the curse of the rotting nursery. Story number 7. A thick mist hung over the estate like a shroud, obscuring the grand, dilapidated mansion from view. The mansion stood at the edge of a dense forest, its once pristine exterior now marred by the ravages of time. Ivy crawled up its crumbling stone walls, entwining itself in every crack and crevice, as if the house itself were trying to escape from the clutches of the past. For years, rumors had swirled about the mansion and its eccentric owner, a man by the name of Dr. Elias Blackwood. The mansion had once been a place of wonder, an institution of learning where the boundaries of science were pushed to their limits. But after Dr. Blackwood's sudden disappearance, it was left to rot, abandoned by society and forgotten by the world. Until now. A group of curious explorers, journalists, thrill seekers, and thrill-hungry adventurers had heard the whispers, the stories that called them to the mansion. They had heard the rumors of Blackwood's twisted experiments, of the strange sounds that emanated from within the walls of the mansion. It was said that if you listened closely enough, you could hear the tortured screams of the failed experiments still trapped within the mansion. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the explorers gathered at the mansion's gates. They were eager to uncover the truth and perhaps make a name for themselves in the process. They didn't know what awaited them inside, but they didn't care. The stories, the challenge, they were irresistible. Jenna, the leader of the group, adjusted her flashlight as she stepped forward. The others followed, each of them hesitant, but driven by the same hunger for discovery. "We're here," Jenna said, her voice steady but tinged with excitement. "Tonight, we uncover Blackwood's secrets." As they approached the front door, the heavy iron hinges groaned in protest as the door swung open of its own accord, as if inviting them in. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, but there was something else too, a faint, acrid odor that seemed to hang in the air. It was the smell of something unnatural, something wrong. "I don't like this," said Adam, the youngest of the group. His voice quivered as he glanced nervously around. "This place feels alive." "You're just being paranoid," Jenna dismissed, though even she couldn't deny the unease that crawled up her spine. "It's just an old mansion. Nothing more." The group stepped inside, their footsteps echoing through the vast, empty halls. The mansion was a labyrinth of dark corridors and grand, decaying rooms. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, and the air felt cold, despite the warmth outside. As they ventured deeper into the heart of the mansion, a low hum filled the air, a sound so faint it was barely perceptible, but it was there, lurking beneath the silence. They made their way through the mansion's darkened hallways, their flashlights casting eerie shadows against the cracked wallpaper. The further they went, the more the house seemed to shift and warp around them, as if the walls were alive, watching them. Every now and then, they would hear a strange, crackling noise from somewhere deeper within the mansion. It sounded like bones snapping, but they couldn't tell where it came from. "This place is giving me the creeps," said Mark, the second in command, as they descended into a lower level of the mansion. The air grew colder, heavier. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the dim flicker of the flashlights did little to stave off the overwhelming sense of dread. "Just a little further," Jenna urged. "We need to find the basement. Blackwood's experiments were rumored to be down there." As they entered a narrow hallway, the smell grew stronger, more pungent. It was the unmistakable stench of rotting flesh, a thick, choking odor that burned the back of their throats. Jenna's hand trembled as she reached for the door at the end of the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed forward. When she touched the door, it swung open with ease. But what they saw beyond it was far worse than they could have imagined. The basement was a cavernous, damp space, its stone walls cracked and covered in mold. Faint light filtered through small, grimy windows near the ceiling, casting long, angular shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, discarded tools, and old yellowing papers that had been left to rot. But it wasn't the decaying surroundings that made the explorer's skin crawl. It was the walls. The walls. They were alive. As the group ventured deeper into the basement, they noticed the strange, unnatural markings on the walls, patterns that seemed to shift and move when they weren't looking directly at them. The wallpaper, once a faded green, was now peeling and curling at the edges, and beneath it, something shifted, something dark and writhing. Jenna's flashlight flickered as she pointed it toward one of the walls, her breath catching in her throat. At first, it seemed like an optical illusion, a trick of the light. But as the group moved closer, they realized the truth. The walls were breathing. The wallpaper seemed to pulse, as though veins ran beneath the surface, and faint whispers filled the air. Soft, insistent voices that carried through the basement like a lullaby. The words were indistinguishable at first, but soon they became clearer. "Join us." The voice was low, hollow, and filled with a deep, sorrowful hunger. The words echoed through the room, seeming to come from every direction at once. Adam looked at Jenna, his face pale with fear. "This isn't right," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to leave. Now." Jenna, however, was transfixed by the sight before her. The walls seemed to draw closer, the pulsating veins shifting and twisting as if they were alive. Something was moving beneath the surface, something trapped within the walls, struggling to break free. And then, it happened. Without warning, a loud cracking sound filled the air, followed by a sickening crunch. Mark, who had been standing near the wall, suddenly screamed in agony as something unseen grabbed him. His body jerked forward, pulled toward the wall as though the very stone had come alive. "Mark!" Jenna cried, reaching for him, but it was too late. Mark's scream was cut off abruptly as his body was pulled into the wall, his form disappearing into the dark, twisting veins of the mansion. His final scream echoed in the basement, reverberating off the walls before it was swallowed by the darkness. Jenna stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Join us!" It was then that she realized Mark hadn't been the first. The walls of the mansion had claimed others before them, and they would claim them too if they weren't careful. The house was alive, feeding on the living, drawing them into its grotesque host. Panic set in as the group scrambled toward the stairs, desperate to escape. But the moment Jenna's hand touched the railing, a sharp, searing pain shot through her arm. She gasped in shock and looked down to see her skin beginning to ripple, as though something beneath it was moving. "Jenna, get out of here!" Adam screamed. But Jenna couldn't move. The pain intensified, and her arm seemed to twist unnaturally as the veins beneath her skin began to pulse, like the very walls of the mansion had found their way into her body. In that moment, Jenna realized the horrible truth. The mansion was not just alive, it was feeding on them, turning them into part of its grotesque, living host. The whispering voices grew louder, more frantic, as the walls closed in on them. They could hear bones cracking, the sound of bodies shifting within the walls, the long-dead experiments of Dr. Blackwood, still trapped in their eternal prison. The walls were hungry, and they would not stop until they had claimed every last one of them. "Join us!" As the darkness closed in, Jenna's scream echoed through the mansion, swallowed by the living walls. The house had claimed them all, and now they were part of the host, forever bound to the mansion's cursed walls. We made it to the end, but the terror doesn't stop here. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. If you enjoyed the story, share it with a friend, and let's see who else can survive our next nightmare.